I am thrilled to bring in a new face on the program this evening. Please welcome Nate Hochman. He's a senior advisor at America 2100, which is a group that states in its own words that America deserves a future as great as its past. And you know what? I find that pretty hard to disagree with. Nate, thank you so much for joining me on the U.S. Report. Welcome to the program. I wanted to first of all talk to you about a piece you've written in the American Spectator magazine that makes a very interesting point, suggesting essentially that Joe Biden, for all of the flaws that we see and the mental difficulties and the word salads and everything else, he's actually a perfect representative of the ruling class. And in this piece, you write, and forgive me for quoting at length, that Biden may not resemble the younger, more diverse, and more cunning members of his shadow cabinet that have been running his presidency for the past 3.5 years, but in a more fundamental sense, he is the personification of the broader social forces they represent. Enervated, humiliated, and alone, the bureaucratic state slouches towards November, no longer sure of who they are or what they stand for. Nate, tell us about what you meant by all of this.
Right. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. The point of that column was to say, obviously Biden's problems are self-evident, but in many ways his problems are a personification of everything that's wrong with the broader sort of American elite, both in and outside of government. He's running on a story that he tells about himself and the country that nobody believes anymore, using slogans that have been drained of all meaning and appealing to institutions that have lost all legitimacy. And he has thus far used that as a crutch to try to hold up his presidency. But what you've seen over the last couple months in particular is that it's really all falling apart. And I think his team is starting to realize that.
Well, and who is this managerial class, this elite class? Tell us about exactly who these people are, because Donald Trump talks about the swamp and people talk about the elite, but really explain to our viewers who these sorts of folks are, what offices they hold, and how they kind of manage to pull the strings behind the scenes.
Well, look, every society has an elite. Every society has a ruling class, and there's nothing wrong with that per se, but the character of a country depends to an extent on the character of its elite, of the people who run the country. And America, for the last 60 plus years, has been run by bureaucrats, effectively, both in the federal bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., but also their counterparts in, big media, big business, big culture, et cetera. You can go down the line. And these are people who are very much part of the same social strata. They're educated in the same elite institutions. They believe the same things. They're often quite literally located in the same geographic enclaves in a couple urban centers. And they are a class of people in a coherent sense. And they are the people who really bear the responsibility for the disastrous decisions that America and more broadly Western civilization has been led down over the last few decades in particular.
Well, Nate, I mean, this is something that we see completely with this situation where the media covered for the Biden White House and all of their lines that, no, he's fine, and all of the things that we show on this program about how he's not fine is just cheap fakes. And they do it without any sort of coordinating kind of effort. You would suggest then, I guess, that it's more of a hive mind mentality where a similar set of outlooks leads to a similar set of outcomes.
No, I think that's the perfect way to put it. Obviously, you do have things that you could call conspiracies. You do have sort of coordinated attempts to do certain things like cover up the Hunter Biden laptop, to use a recent example. But more broadly, this is a kind of self-running machine where you don't need a degree of centralized coordination because everyone has the same worldview and the same objectives and the same goals, and perhaps most importantly, the same enemies and the same things that they are working against. And therefore, it works as a well-oiled machine. Yeah.
Yes. So it's basically like, oh, well, we all agree that Trump is evil, Trump is the devil. So whatever we do to stop him, even if it means lying and covering up for this huge scandalous health problem in the White House, that's okay.
Exactly. And even more fundamentally, what Trump represents is everything in terms of the values and the identities that this class of people is against. He represents the precise old America that these people define themselves in opposition to. They are the quote unquote new America, and Trump is the old, white, chauvinistic Christian America that they've spent the last 60 years basically trying to destroy. And as a result, Trump is the existential threat to these people's power and to their conception of themselves. And that's why, again, you don't need a level of coordination because they're all going to work against him in tandem regardless.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point you make about sort of who these new class people are and everything else in that hive mind. But also one of the things that I've heard you talk about, too, is I thought this was hilarious, the backlash against the idea that Kamala Harris was a diversity pick. Now, Joe Biden and his White House were pretty explicit when they picked her that this was to balance out the ticket from a diversity point of view. But now suddenly everybody's gotten mad at the New York Post for suggesting that, yeah, in fact, she was a DEI hire. But come on, right?
No, I mean, conservatives in America, maybe there's a corollary phrase that you guys use over there. We call this the celebration parallax, which is summed up by the phrase, that's not happening and it's good that it is. And that's the attitude you hear from, the media on a whole host of different issues, which is effectively we're allowed to celebrate something and point out that it's happening in a good way. But if anyone on the right points out that it's happening and says, but that's bad, then it's a total conspiracy theory, right? So you can celebrate that Kamala Harris is a DEI pick, a victory for DEI, but you can't criticize it.
I love this idea of the celebration parallax here, and I suspect there's an awful lot of that also goes into the way that we discuss immigration in the United States. And you've noted that there's this really interesting phenomenon where migrants are, of course, more likely to favor more migration. So in a sense, there's kind of this the real reason why I would suspect that you're suggesting is that they're so keen on open borders is to permanently change the kind of direction that the country goes. Now, we get dismissed as being conspiracy theorists for that, but I think there's probably something to that. What do you think, Nate?
No, I'm glad you pointed that out because that was originally the concept that the celebration parallax was used for. We hear talk about the quote-unquote great replacement and how it's a right-wing conspiracy theory. People on the left in America have been explicitly celebrating the fact that American demographics are changing drastically and that that's going to make America more liberal for decades. You can look in the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. They're saying this is happening and isn't it great? But if anyone on the right points out that it's happening and says, hey, maybe I might have some concerns about how this is going to affect my country, then it's a dangerous right-wing conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And it becomes alt-right. Anyway, Nate Hochman, thank you so much for joining us here on the U.S. Report. We'll definitely have you back again. Thank you so much for your time on this historic day. Now, before we go to the break, let me make clear one more time that despite all the president's troubles, the Democrats, and I talk about this as the Democrat Party, are still in this race. And I don't care what the polls say about Trump being up. It's a long way to go to November, and as we know, anything can happen. Just check this little clip out. It's an interview CNN did with somebody who I suspect is a fairly typical Democrat voter who thinks Joe Biden is not up to it, Kamala Harris is not qualified, and is still going to go vote for the Democrats no matter what.
Did he look to you like someone who could serve for president for 4.5 more years?
I think that let me put it this way. I'm voting for the party right now.
Do you think Vice President Harris is qualified to be president?
No.
Trump supporters, Trump campaign, if you're watching, don't get cocky.